This evening begins a journey, a marathon from the table to the cross. This period in the church calendar is known as the Easter or Holy Tribune. In these next 72 hours, we will journey as individuals and as a community of faith into the passion, the crucifixion, the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. But before we get to a full tomb sealed shut and now empty, colored eggs, or Easter brunch, we must first wrestle with this scene unfolding around the table in John 13. John 13 begins Jesus' farewell address, which goes until John 17. Throughout the Old and New Testaments, there are several farewell addresses offered. Other farewell addresses in Scripture include Moses' in Deuteronomy, Joshua's in Joshua, and Paul in Acts. The scene is unorthodox and confusing for the disciples. Jesus' actions on what we might call the inaugural Maundy Thursday are anything but normal for a Passover gathering. John gives us two quick signs that the activities of this evening are to be understood perhaps as the symbolic summary of Jesus' entire ministry. First, if we look at the beginning of chapter 13, it says, having loved his own, he loved them to the end. Now, the word end is purposefully ambiguous here. It could mean end in the sense of the final purpose or goal. But it also could mean end in the sense of conclusion, or at the end of the story. Both meanings are significant. The Last Supper, with its meal and the foot washing, is the penultimate act with the disciples. The second signal is that in John's account of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, he offers us this really beautiful summation of Jesus' entire life. Jesus gets up from the table, he takes off his robe, and he puts on a towel. Another way of considering this moment is that Jesus leaves heaven, the table, puts aside his markings of divinity, perhaps the robe, and takes human form to serve, that is the towel. Then Jesus faces confrontation by Peter, just as he faces confrontation throughout his ministries. Here are a few of these parallels. He offers teaching and prophecy in this intimate moment with the disciples, with Peter, just as he also does throughout the rural and the urban areas of his missional work. He asks questions and provides an example on an alternative way of living with our neighbors, just as he does so many times in Galilee and on his journey to Jerusalem. Then here in John, Jesus gets up, puts his robe back on, and returns to the table, just as he'll return to heaven and assume his place on the throne in a few days. This succinct, I would say, highlights reel of the gospel story indicates that the foot washing is a summary of what Jesus is all about. In the exchange, we typically may see Christ as the servant leader. For this is the gospel we want to hear and to follow. Jesus as a servant leader doesn't necessarily change our lives significantly, though. Jesus gave his life to make sure we don't have to give ours. And our way of showing gratitude or humility now and again, is a way to give back. So maybe getting down on our knees and doing a little foot washing, at least in a figurative way. I've often read the foot washing story and said, it's good to be humble. What a good idea. But is that really the gospel? Is that really what's going on at this tableside scene? This is the gospel we probably don't want to hear. Yes, in John 13, Jesus gets down on his knees and washes the disciples' feet. But just a chapter earlier, Mary of Bethany gets down on her knees and washes Jesus' feet with her hair. There's plenty of reasons why what she's doing might be scandalous, but Jesus praises Mary for one single reason. She alone has realized that Jesus is about to die. She is washing his feet to prepare his body for burial. And now here we are, just one chapter later, and it's a second foot washing scene. The gospel we want urges us to read this as a lesson in humility, in servant leadership. But perhaps God isn't interested in the gospel we desire to hear. The text in front of us shows the same as the first scene in chapter 12. Jesus is saying, Mary prepared me to die. Now I'm preparing you to die. When considered as a whole, the curious statements uttered in this chapter begin to make sense. Peter says to Jesus, "You will never wash my feet." Fair enough. Peter doesn't want to die. Who can blame him? Peter might be articulating what we're all feeling if we think about it through this lens. We love Jesus until the moment he asked us to die. Then perhaps we might say, enough, tap me out, I'm done, I'm good, I don't need to go now. But listen to Jesus' reply in light of what we can now see foot washing maybe to mean. Jesus said, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. In other words, unless you are willing to die with me, you can't expect to share in my resurrection. So to this, Peter excitedly proclaims, Lord, not just my feet, but wash my arms and my hair and everything. This is probably the hardest part of the story to unpack. But it falls into place if we read it through the lens of foot washing and baptism, which we might say are the bookends of the Christian journey. Jesus reinforces this idea when he says in verse 10, one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean. In other words, baptism. Baptism prepares us for life, but foot washing prepares us for death. Peter is saying, wash me all over, Jesus, baptize me again, please. And Jesus is saying, no, Peter, you've been baptized. In baptism, you pass from the darkness to the light. You don't need to be baptized again. All that needs washing right now are your feet. And that's because washing feet is preparing you for the next step. Washing feet is inviting you to face the full circle of your baptism. In verse 12, as we move along, Jesus puts on his robe and returns to the table. He says, you call me teacher and Lord. You are right, for that is what I am. If I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. In other words, if I've been preparing you to face death, you need to get into the habit of preparing each other to face death. Here again are the two, might we say, fundamental moments in our Christian life. Baptism is the beginning, the moment where we pass from death to life, the moment where the power of death ceases to dominate our imaginations. And foot washing is at the end, the moment when we are prepared to face death, the moment when we help one another face the reality. Have you washed any feet lately? Have you prepared anyone for death? I know some have in the congregation lately. Have you helped anyone face what it is to live into the baptism? Has anyone done that for you? None of us, deep down, probably want to hear this type of gospel. We want the church to be about making friends, feeling spiritual, and offering service. We don't really want it to be about preparing one another for what comes next. Jesus speaks the truth. The truth takes him from this room and this space, through the trials tonight, through the crowds that are mocking him, and to the cross. Why? Because Jesus is about reconciliation and witness in the face of oppression and with communities who make a mockery of God. That's his whole ministry. He calls us to follow him. He says, quite simply, I have set you an example. Now go and do. And if we intend to follow this example and this commandment, we shall go to the cross too. For the first disciples in the early church, this literally was true. It meant piercing nails, splintered wood, asphyxiation, agony, and martyrdom. For us, it may mean being humiliated or defamed for our faith. It may mean losing our jobs or ourselves in the name of pleasing the world. It may mean being subject to violence against us, or being imprisoned or restricted to travel to places to share the gospel. It could mean no free speech or the ability to teach about God's love. This is what happens to people when they spend their lives devoted to reconciliation, to truth, and to Jesus. We probably don't want that gospel. We want the servant ministry thing instead. It's much nicer and a bit easier. But the question for us tonight is, Jesus wants to wash your feet. He's been preparing for death for a while. It's time for him to prepare us to live in a world where we are not tucked under his wing. He did it for the disciples, and it's offered to us now. Jesus is kneeling before us as he did the disciples because he loves us. He'll love us tonight. He'll love us through the agony of tomorrow and until the end.